You know, I feel like usually when we talk about reading a book, there's this ingrained expectation of a very simple logical progression.
Oh, for sure. You
Yeah.
want a straight line.
Right. You open to page one, you read the first chapter, it sets up the character, sets up the world, and you just follow that timeline all the way to the end. It's safe, it's predictable.
Yeah, we are absolutely conditioned to expect a linear narrative. I mean, we want our stories to unfold exactly as we experience time,
Hmm.
chronologically, neatly, moving from cause to effect.
Yeah, exactly. Beginning, middle, end. But then you step into the world of the New Testament, and suddenly that linear reading experience is just completely thrown out the window.
It really is.
Because we are looking at a literary landscape that is, structurally speaking, total backward.
Right. It is the absolute definition of a compiled, curated library rather than a single chronological novel.
Yeah.
And honestly, if you approach it expecting a novel, you're going to get very confused very quickly.
I mean, I certainly did. Well, welcome to the deep dive, everyone. If you have ever felt intimidated by this massive collection of ancient texts, you are absolutely not alone.
Definitely not alone.
Today, our mission is to decode a foundational stack of research compiled from Chris R. Villas's survey of the entire New Testament. The goal here is to strip away that intimidating complexity.
Yeah, we really want to demystify it.
Exactly. We are going to look at this 27-book collection and give you a master key to understanding its historical roots, its architectural structure, and, honestly, the gritty, often brutal cultural realities that actually shaped every single word.
And it is a remarkable world to explore. I mean, most people who pick up these texts read them completely unaware of two massive underlying realities.
Okay, what are they?
First, like you just hinted at, they read them without knowing they were actually written backward chronologically compared to how they're arranged in the table of content.
Which is wild to think about.
Right? And second, they read them without realizing just how heavily these texts were influenced, pressured, and shaped by Roman imperial power.
Yeah, the politics of it all.
Exactly. That and this intense underlying psychological dynamic of honor and shame.
Okay, let's unpack this, because before we can even look at the texts themselves, we really have to travel back to the first century. We need to understand the soil from which these texts grew.
The dirt, essentially.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
What was the world actually like when these words were first spoken and eventually written down? Because, it wasn't a bunch of guys sitting in a quiet modern library.
Oh, not at all. Not even close. The historical setting is what scholars call Second Temple Judaism, and it exists entirely under the crushing weight of Roman imperial domination.
Wow, crushing weight is a good way to put it.
Yeah, because this isn't just a neutral, distant political backdrop,
Oh, yeah.
It is the defining reality of their daily waking lives.
Let me stop you there for a second just to make sure we're all on the same page. When you say Second Temple Judaism, what exactly does that mean? Like, why is the temple so central to the naming of the entire era?
That's a great question. So the first temple was built by Solomon, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that was destroyed by the Babylonians around 586 BCE.
Okay, got it.
After the Jewish people returned from exile, they rebuilt it. And that's the Second Temple.
That makes sense.
Yeah. And that physical building in Jerusalem became the absolute epicenter of Jewish identity, worship, politics, all of it for centuries, right up until the Romans destroyed it in 70 CE.
So it was the hub of everything.
Completely. So the entire New Testament era essentially takes place during the twilight of this Second Temple period. But the key thing to remember is even though they had their temple, they weren't free.
Right, they're living under the Roman boot.
Exactly. You have Herodian client kings ruling locally. These were men like Herod the Great.
Who were basically just installed by Rome to keep the peace, right?
Right. Keep the peace and, more importantly, collect taxes. They weren't true kings in the traditional sense. I mean, they were essentially middle managers for the empire.
Middle managers with crowns.
Exactly. And then you have provincial governors, the most famous one, of course, being Pontius Pilate, who governed the region of Judea from 26 to 36 CE.
Okay, so you have this tense political structure.
Yeah. And surrounding all of this Jewish life are these really aggressive Greco-Roman realities.
What does that actually look like on the ground? I mean, are we talking about statues of Caesar on every corner?
Oh, absolutely. Statues, temples, coins, the imagery was everywhere. We're talking about the emperor cult, where the Roman emperor is revered almost as a deity.
Wow.
And perhaps even more pervasive than that is the system of patronal religion.
Patronal religion, like a patronage system.
Precisely. In the ancient Mediterranean, relationships were built on this strict vertical hierarchy of patrons giving favors and clients owing loyalty.
Like the mafia.
Well, kind of, yeah. There was no middle class. There was no social safety net. If you wanted to survive, you basically had to attach yourself to a wealthy patron.
And what did they do for you?
They would provide you with food, work, or legal protection. But in return, you owed them absolute public loyalty and honor. It was this massive societal web of debt and obligation.
Wow. So if you're a lower class person, which, most of the early Christians were, your entire survival depends on pleasing someone further up the ladder.
Exactly.
And it wasn't just the politics from the top down, right? The research points out that the social fabric itself was incredibly rigid. This world was defined by patriarchal households.
Very much so. The paterfamilias, which is the male head of the household, had absolute legal authority over everyone under his roof.
Everyone.
Everyone. His wife, his children, and his slaves.
Man. And the research highlights that you have incredibly vulnerable groups in this system, like widows and orphans.
Most vulnerable, yeah.
Today, I feel like we might view caring for widows and orphans as just a nice charitable thing to do. But in that context, it sounds like a massive economic crisis, not just a sad reality.
It was an absolute crisis. I mean, if you lose the male head of the household, you lose your connection to the patronage system.
Oh, wow. I didn't even think about that.
Yeah, you lose your legal protection, you lose your income. Widows and orphans were the ultimate marginalized people because they essentially had zero social leverage.
That is brutal.
And add to that the fact that slavery was a pervasive foundational feature of the Roman household economy.
Which is something we kind of gloss over sometimes.
We do. And it's important to note, it wasn't based on race, as in the tragic history of the American South. It was usually based on warfare, debt, or just being born to an enslaved mother.
But it was still inescapable.
Totally inescapable. Slaves were property, and they were essential to the economic engine of Rome.
And to top it all off, it is an oral culture, right? Like, literacy was incredibly limited.
Extremely limited.
Imagine trying to run a global movement today without email, without texts, without even like a basic printed handbook you could hand out to your followers.
It's almost impossible for us to picture.
Yeah, you are relying entirely on the memory of the person standing in your living room.
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, it actually explains a structural feature of the New Testament that confuses a lot of modern readers.
Oh, like what?
Have you ever wondered why the New Testament epistles focus so heavily on what scholars call household codes?
Oh, you mean those sections where Paul is giving very specific instructions to husbands and wives and masters and enslaved people and parents and children?
Exactly. I mean, modern readers often approach the text wanting this abstract, lofty theological treatise on the nature of the universe.
Right, they want philosophy.
Right. But instead, they get instructions on how a husband should treat his wife or how a slave should act. And people wonder, why the focus on the mundane?
I know, I always thought it felt a bit like reading a first century HR manual. It just seems so disconnected from the grand cosmic stuff.
It feels that way to us, but it was absolutely essential to them. You have to remember, the early church wasn't born in a lecture hall.
Or a cathedral.
Right. It wasn't born in massive cathedrals. It was born in urban house churches. These new communities were gathering in the actual living rooms of the Greco-Roman world.
In the middle of all that patriarchal household structure.
Exactly. Their theology had to be lived out in the daily grueling grind of the Roman household economy.
That makes so much sense.
When they confessed that Jesus is Lord, which, by the way, was a direct challenge to Caesar as Lord, that had immediate practical friction with a society built on sharp class gradients.
Oh, I bet.
Yeah, and the absolute authority of the Roman patriarch, they had to figure out how to live out a radical new equality while still physically trapped in an unequal system.
Wow, it really grounds the text in the dirt of reality.
It really does.
And what really stands out in the research we are looking at today is that we actually have the dirt to prove it. This isn't mythological, it's historical. We have tangible archaeological proof of this world.
We do, and it is so vital to remember that.
Because for a long time, skeptics argue that a lot of the characters in the New Testament were just, literary inventions, right?
Exactly.
Like Pontius Pilate. I read that until the middle of the 20th century, there was very little extra-biblical evidence he even existed.
That's true. Until archaeologists discovered the Pilate stone in Caesarea Maritima back in 1961.
Oh, wow. What is that exactly?
It's this first-century Latin inscription on a block of limestone, and it literally names Pontius Pilate as the prefect of Judea.
Boom! Right there in stone.
Exactly. Suddenly, Pilate goes from being viewed by some as a potential literary device to a concrete, historically verified Roman official with his exact title carved in stone.
And it doesn't stop there. There's the Gallio inscription found in Delphi, Greece. I want to spend a second on this because,
Yeah.
well, it sounds like a boring rock, but it acts as a massive chronological anchor for the whole timeline.
Oh, it is the Rosetta Stone for New Testament chronology.
Really? How so?
Well, the book of Acts mentions that the Apostle Paul was brought to trial in Corinth before a Roman proconsul named Gallio.
Okay.
Now, archaeologists found an inscription in Delphi, which is a letter from the Emperor Claudius, and it mentions this exact Gallio and dates his proconsulship specifically to around 51 or 52 CE.
No way. So because of that one rock in Greece, we know exactly when Paul was in Corinth.
Exactly. It anchors the entire timeline of Paul's life and letters.
That is incredible.
And then, jumping back to Jerusalem, you have the Caiaphas ossuary.
An ossuary is a bone box, right?
Yes, exactly. In 1990, workers building a water park in Jerusalem accidentally uncovered a first-century burial cave.
A water park? You can't make this stuff up.
I know, and inside was this incredibly ornate limestone ossuary inscribed with the name Joseph, son of Caiaphas.
The very high priest who presided over the trial of Jesus.
The very same. And the ornate carvings really illuminate the immense wealth and the burial customs of the priestly class at the time.
These artifacts are just such a great reminder that the New Testament is unusually well situated in archaeological space.
Very well situated.
We're dealing with named governors, real cities, established trade routes. But navigating those physical routes meant you also had to navigate a very specific psychological terrain.
Absolutely.
And I want to bring up this concept of honor and shame because it really dominates the cultural analysis of this period.
It is the invisible operating system of the ancient Mediterranean.
You know, reading about it, it sounds incredibly similar to modern-day social media reputation and cancel culture.
That's actually a really good comparison.
Yeah, you have a public reputation,
Mm-hmm.
and that reputation is literally worth more than money. Losing it isn't just embarrassing, it is a kind of social death.
That is a highly accurate modern
Yeah.
parallel. I mean, in our culture, we tend to operate on a guilt-innocence paradigm. You know?
All right, it's internalized.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If you do something wrong, you feel guilty inside, even if literally no one else knows. But an honor-shame culture is entirely externalized.
So it's all about how others see you.
Right. Honor is your public worth, as recognized by your community. You basically spend your entire life trying to acquire honor and avoid shame.
So thinking about the central event of the New Testament Jesus' execution on a cross, was that essentially the ultimate status reversal? Because crucifixion wasn't just painful, it was designed to be humiliating, right?
Oh, crucifixion was the Roman Empire's mechanism for absolute public cancellation.
Wow.
It was designed to strip a person of all dignity, all honor, and render them a public cautionary tale.
Yeah.
They were stripped naked, tortured in public, and left to be eaten by scavengers.
Just horrific.
It was the ultimate shame.
But the New Testament narrative claims that this ultimate humiliation was actually the mechanism for the salvation of the world. That must have sounded like absolute madness to a Roman.
It was completely scandalous.
Yeah.
In fact, the Apostle Paul himself writes that the cross is foolishness to the Gentiles.
Right, because why would you worship someone who got canceled in the worst way possible?
Exactly.
Yeah.
But for the early Christians, the gospel didn't just offer, private forgiveness of sins. It completely reordered status.
Flipped it upside down.
Yes. The narrative claims that Jesus' shameful death was followed by divine exaltation, the resurrection.
Right.
So suddenly, the exaltation of the humble, the washing of feet, the sharing of a table across strict social boundaries, these became the new metrics for honor.
It's a radical social earthquake. It completely flips the script. The cross becomes a symbol of victory instead of shame.
Precisely.
So knowing this gritty, intense reality of the first century Mediterranean world, how did these early believers actually compile their writings?
Let's look at the architecture.
Yeah, because you mentioned earlier that the structure of the New Testament is backward. Let's look at how this library was actually built.
So the New Testament, as we have it today, is a 27-book collection, and it was originally written entirely in Koine Greek.
Which was the common trade language, right? Like, not the highbrow classical Greek of Homer, but the street Greek of the marketplace.
Exactly. It was the language of the people. It had been made widespread by the conquests of Alexander the Great centuries earlier.
Okay, so they're writing in the common tongue.
Right. Now, canonically, this specific 27-book collection was formally recognized across the church by the 4th century.
So it took a while.
It did. You have major milestones, like a famous letter from Bishop Athanasius in 367 CE, which
Hmm.
is actually the first time we see our exact list of 27 books.
Ah, okay.
And then you have the councils of Hippo and Carthage in the late 300s, solidifying it.
Right.
But here is the critical point, and this is what we were talking about earlier. The order of those 27 books, the way they sit in your table of contents, is purely theological. It is not chronological.
Right. The canonical arrangement is highly curated. It tells a very logical story.
It makes immense theological sense.
Yeah, Jesus comes first in the four Gospels, then the historical mission of the church comes second in the book of Acts. Then the interpretation of all that theology comes third in the epistles, the letters. And finally, the consummation of history, the end of the world, comes last in the book of Revelation.
Wow.
It makes perfect, sweeping, logical sense when you read it straight through.
It really does. You move from the life of Christ, which is the foundation, to the birth of the church, the expansion, to how the church should live, which is the instruction, to how everything ends, the hope.
But the actual historical timeline of when these texts were put to parchment is almost the exact reverse.
Yes.
Walk us through that timeline, because this completely broke my brain the first time I realized it.
Broadly speaking, mainstream chronological surveys place the earliest texts of the New Testament as some of the letters written by the Apostle Paul.
The letters came first.
Specifically books like 1 Thessalonians or Galatians, and these were written in the early 50s CE.
Okay, so roughly 20 years after the crucifixion.
Correct. Then you have the first gospel, the Gospel of Mark, which is generally dated around 65 to 70 CE. And this is often tied to the crisis under the Emperor Nero, who was severely persecuting Christians, or the beginning of the Jewish War, which eventually led to the destruction of the temple.
So the first gospel isn't written until almost 40 years after the events it describes.
Yes, roughly.
Wow.
And then after Mark, you have the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, along with the book of Acts, written somewhere around 80 to 90 CE.
Okay, so even later.
And finally, the Gospel of John and the book of Revelation come toward the late 1st century, around 90 to 95 CE.
Wait, here's where it gets really interesting and where I just have to pause and process this.
Sure.
If Paul is writing his letters in the 50s and the first gospel, Mark, isn't written until around 65 or 70,
Yeah.
that means for decades the earliest Christians did not have the written gospels. They didn't have a book they could open and read the Sermon on the Mount.
They did not.
They were living, worshiping, radically changing their lives, and in some cases dying for a faith, and they had no written biographies of Jesus. How on earth did they know what he said?
Well, it requires a complete paradigm shift for the modern reader. Remember our earlier point, it was an oral culture.
Right, the memory thing.
The early church was sustained by this incredibly robust, carefully memorized oral proclamation of the apostles.
But wasn't that like playing the childhood game of telephone, where a whisper just gets distorted by the time it reaches the end of the line?
Not at all. That's a common misconception. Ancient Jewish oral tradition was communal, and it was self-correcting.
Self-correcting.
Yes, the teachings of Jesus were memorized, chanted, and passed down in groups. If someone got it wrong, the community would correct them.
Oh, that makes sense.
And alongside that, they had the public reading of early letters, like Paul's, which were circulating among the house churches.
So why write the Gospels down at all if the oral tradition was working so well?
Well, a shift happened in the 60s CE.
What kind of shift?
The original eyewitnesses, the apostles who actually walked with Jesus, began to age and pass away, and often through martyrdom. Peter and Paul are traditionally believed to have been executed in Rome under Nero in the mid-60s. So, as the living links to the historical Jesus began to die, and as the church expanded geographically across the Roman Empire, they realized they needed a permanent, authoritative, written foundation.
The movement was just getting too big for oral tradition alone.
Exactly. The theology was maturing, the crises were deepening, and oral tradition was just no longer enough for a global movement.
You know, it's almost like watching a massive movie franchise completely out of release order.
What do you mean?
Well, it's like watching the Star Wars prequels after you've already seen the original trilogy.
Ah, I see.
The epistles, Paul's letters, are the original releases. They are the live, urgent updates from the front lines of the mission. They are dealing with immediate crises.
Yes.
But the Gospels are the official origin story, the prequels, written slightly later to document for the next generation exactly how it all started.
That is a brilliant way to conceptualize it. I love that. The letters address the immediate, messy, on-the-ground reality in these new startup communities. And then the Gospels step back and provide the definitive biographical and theological anchor.
So with the timeline demystified, Let's dive into that foundational origin story itself. Let's look at the Gospels and the immediate aftermath in the book of Acts.
Let's do it.
The source material describes the four Gospels as ancient biographical narratives with theological aims. They essentially give us four distinct camera angles on the life of Jesus.
Four very different angles, yes.
But why four? I mean, if they're trying to preserve the history, why not just write one official authorized biography and be done with it?
Because ancient biographies, unlike modern ones, were not obsessed with chronological trivia.
Right. They weren't trying to write a Wikipedia page.
Exactly.
Uh,
A modern biography wants to tell you exactly what the subject ate for breakfast, the precise color of their tunic, and list every single event in strict chronological order. The Gospels are doing something far more sophisticated. They are narrative theology.
Narrative theology, what does that mean in practice?
It means they are arranging historical events, speeches, and actions to make a specific theological argument about who Jesus is.
Oh,
They're answering the question, who is Jesus and what does his life mean for us? And because the early church was incredibly diverse, made up of Jews, Greeks, Romans, the rich, the poor,
yeah, a real mix of people.
they needed different angles to communicate that reality to those different audiences.
So let's break those angles down. Let's start with Matthew. What is Matthew's primary argument?
Matthew is deeply Jewish. He presents Jesus primarily as the fulfillment of Israel's story.
The Davidic Messiah.
Exactly. He wants to prove that Jesus is the long-awaited king. And structurally, Matthew organizes his gospel around 5 major teaching blocks or discourses.
Hold on. 5 blocks? Is that just a coincidence, or is he doing that on purpose?
Oh, it is absolutely intentional. Think about it. What is the foundational text of Judaism?
The Torah, right. The 5 books of Moses.
Exactly. By structuring his gospel around 5 major speeches, the most famous being the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew is subtly presenting Jesus as a new, greater Moses.
Oh, wow.
Just as Moses went up a mountain to deliver the law, Jesus goes up a mountain to deliver the ethics of the kingdom of heaven.
That is fascinating. The literary structure itself is making a theological point.
It really is.
So Matthew is highly structured, very focused on prophecy and teaching. What about Mark?
Mark is the complete opposite in terms of pacing. Mark is a rapid sequence narrative,
I'm like fast-paced.
breathless. The Greek word euthys, which means immediately, appears over and over again.
Just constantly pushing the story forward.
Yes. Mark doesn't start with a birth narrative. He just drops you right into the action with Jesus as an adult.
Action movie pacing.
Exactly. He focuses heavily on Jesus' actions, his power over demons in nature, and then, interestingly, slows the narrative down dramatically for the final week of his life.
That's a huge shift in pacing.
It is. Mark presents Jesus as the suffering Son of God driving relentlessly toward the cross. It reads like an action movie that turns into a tragedy, ending with the ultimate triumph.
And then you have Luke. Luke has this beautiful, expansive view. I've always heard Luke was a physician, and you can almost feel that care in how he writes.
Yes, Luke emphasizes salvation coming to the marginalized. He really highlights people that society ignored.
Like who?
Women, the poor, tax collectors, Samaritans. They are constantly the heroes or the focus of Luke's narrative.
He really zeroes in on the outsiders.
He does. Furthermore, Luke has a very global vision. He wants to show that the salvation Jesus brings isn't just a localized Jewish event, it's for all nations.
And finally, John. John is the outlier, isn't he? It feels completely different from the other 3.
John is highly philosophical and deeply theological. He doesn't start with a genealogy like Matthew or the baptism like Mark.
Right, he starts in space, basically.
Yes. He starts in the cosmos. In the beginning was the Word, the Logos. John organizes his gospel not around a rapid sequence of events, but around deep theological signs.
Miracles that point to a greater truth.
Exactly. And those famous I am statements.
Let's pause on those I am statements because, I am the bread of life, I am the light of the world. For a modern reader, it just sounds like Jesus is using nice metaphors.
It does sound like that to us.
But in a first-century Jewish context, isn't he doing something much more dangerous?
Very dangerous. He is invoking the sacred, unutterable name of God.
From the Old Testament.
Yes. In the book of Exodus, when Moses is at the burning bush, he asks God for his name. God replies, I am, WHO, I am.
Right.
For a Jewish rabbi to walk around saying, I am the light of the world, or before Abraham was, I am, it wasn't just a metaphor. It was a direct claim to divinity.
Which explains why people got so mad.
Oh, yeah. That's why his opponents frequently picked up stones to kill him after he made those statements. It was blasphemy to them.
It's electric when you read it with that context. So think about it like 4 different documentary directors covering the exact same incredible subject.
That's a great analogy.
One director wants to focus entirely on his teaching and his connection to ancient prophecies, and that's Matthew. Another director makes an action-packed, fast-paced short film focusing on his suffering and authority. That's Mark.
Yes.
Another director is deeply concerned with social justice, the poor, and the outcasts. That's Luke. And the last director makes this highly artsy, philosophical deep dive into the cosmic meaning of it all. That's John.
That captures the literary variety perfectly.
And Luke, our third director, didn't stop with the gospel. He wrote a second volume, the Book of Acts.
Right. Luke and Acts are really a 2-part series.
So if the Gospels answer, who is Jesus, what does Acts answer?
Acts answers the question, how did the gospel spread? Acts is a selective historical narrative showing the Holy Spirit expanding the church. And the geographic progression in Acts is incredibly deliberate.
The thesis statement is right there at the beginning, isn't it? In Acts chapter 1, verse 8.
Yes, exactly.
Jesus says, "You will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth." And then the rest of the book literally follows that map.
The movement is relentless. It starts Jerusalem, the epicenter of Judaism. From there, persecution pushes the believers outward into Judea and Samaria.
It's like ripples in a pond.
Exactly. Then, through the missionary journeys of the Apostle Paul, the message crosses into the Gentile world, Asia Minor, Greece, and it finally climaxes in Rome.
And the research we have provides some incredible geographical and archaeological anchors for this narrative.
It really does.
You mentioned Jerusalem being the center. The notes point out the newly excavated pool of Siloam. This is directly tied to the Gospel of John, chapter 9, where Jesus heals a man born blind and tells him to wash in the pool of Siloam.
Right.
For a long time, people weren't exactly sure where this was, but didn't they literally just dig it up recently?
Yes. In 2004, during some sewer repair work in Jerusalem, archaeologists uncovered stone steps.
During sewer repair?
Yeah. They excavated further and found the monumental pool of Siloam exactly where the text implied it would be.
That is mind-blowing. They are fixing a sewer and accidentally validate a 2,000-year-old text.
It just grounds the narrative in concrete reality. The text isn't taking place in a mythical realm, it's taking place on real stone steps.
Yeah.
But the narrative arc of Acts pushes violently away from that center in Jerusalem. It pushes all the way to the other center of the world, Rome.
The heart of the empire.
Yes. Rome is the destination of Paul's witness, and it is the symbol of ultimate world power. It represents the ultimate clash between Caesar's claim to absolute authority and the early church's claim that Christ is Lord.
Right.
And Acts leaves the narrative open-ended right there in Rome, with Paul under house arrest but still preaching boldly, showing that the kingdom is unstoppable.
But let's be realistic here. If Acts is the story of the church rapidly spreading across the map to places like Corinth and Ephesus and Rome, what happens when those brand new communities inevitably run into trouble?
And they absolutely ran into trouble.
Because you've got mixed communities of Jews and Gentiles, rich and poor, slaves and masters, all trying to live together in a hyper-pagan world, it couldn't have been smooth sailing.
Oh, it was incredibly messy. And that is exactly where the epistles come in.
Enter the epistles.
Yes. The rapid expansion created massive pastoral and theological crises. The New Testament contains 21 epistles or letters in total. 13 are attributed to the Apostle Paul, and 8 are known as the general epistle.
And those were written by figures like Peter, James, and John.
Correct. And it's so important to understand that these were not written as abstract, systematic theology textbooks.
They weren't just writing for the sake of writing.
No, they were written as troubleshooting documents to shape the church's faith and obedience in the midst of extreme crises.
So let's focus on Paul for a minute. The research breaks down Paul's letters by outlining his logic map. And I really want to pause on this because understanding this map fundamentally changes how you read him.
It really does. Paul's logic almost always follows a very specific sequential map. He constantly starts with what scholars call gospel indicatives.
Gospel indicatives. Okay, what is an indicative?
An indicative is simply a statement of fact. He starts by declaring what God has already done in Christ.
Okay.
He does not start with rules. He starts with grace, rescue, and reality.
Can you give me an example? Like, break down indicative versus imperative, like I'm 5 years old.
Okay, think about a family.
All right.
If you approach a child and say, you must obey these 10 rules perfectly, and if you do, maybe I will adopt you and make you part of the family.
Yikes.
Right, that is an imperative leading to an identity. It's based on performance. And that is emphatically not how Paul operates.
How does he do it?
Paul says, you have already been adopted. You are fiercely loved. You are a full member of this family. That is the indicative reality.
The statement of fact.
Exactly. And then he says, therefore, because that is who you are, here's how a member of this family behaves.
Ah, so the behavior is a response to the identity, not a requirement to earn it.
Precisely. From the indicative, Paul moves to the concept of union with Christ. This is the idea that the believer's identity is now entirely fused with Jesus.
Okay.
Then he moves to the Spirit-empowered life, explaining that you aren't doing this on your own willpower.
Because that would be exhausting.
Right. And only finally, at the very end of his logic map, does he arrive at the imperatives, the commands, the ethics, the how to behave.
So doctrine and ethics are completely inseparable for Paul. You can't have the behavior without the foundational belief.
Exactly. Let's look at the letter to the Ephesians as a prime example of this.
Okay, walk me through Ephesians.
In the first 3 chapters, the first half of the letter, Paul talks about this massive cosmic theology. He talks about God uniting all things in Christ, and specifically uniting hostile Jews and Gentiles into one new humanity.
And that would have been a massive deal considering the intense racial and religious animosity between Jews and Gentiles in the first century.
Oh, it was explosive.
Yeah.
But it isn't just a nice abstract thought about unity. That massive theological reality directly dictates the household rules in the second half of the letter.
Right, the imperatives.
Yes, if you are truly one new humanity, it fundamentally changes how husbands and wives treat each other.
Yeah.
It fundamentally changes how masters and slaves interact. The high theology dictates the dirt-level reality of the living room.
And the variety in these letters is staggering. I mean, you have the book of Romans, which is this dense, majestic, highly structured treatise on justification by faith.
Very theological.
But then you have a letter like 1 Corinthians. And 1 Corinthians sounds like a church that is completely off the rails.
Oh, Corinth was a mess. It was a wealthy, multicultural, hypersexualized urban center.
Like the Las Vegas of the ancient world.
That's a very fair comparison. And Paul is writing to deal with Christians who are visiting temple prostitutes, suing each other in pagan courts, getting drunk at the Lord's Supper.
Wow.
And dividing into factions based on their favorite celebrity preacher. He is having to apply the cross to the absolute messiest parts of urban life.
And then contrast that massive civic letter with a tiny, deeply personal letter like Philemon. Philemon is just 1 chapter long, but it packs such a punch.
It really does. Philemon shows the gospel transforming the brutal social reality of slavery we discussed earlier.
What's the story there?
Paul is writing to a wealthy Christian named Philemon, whose enslaved man, Onesimus, had run away and somehow met Paul.
Okay.
Paul sends Onesimus back, but he tells Philemon to receive him no longer as a slave, but better than a slave, as a beloved brother.
That's huge.
It's massive. Paul doesn't launch a political revolt against the institution of Rome, but he plants a theological bomb at its foundation.
What do you mean?
If you must treat your slave as an equal, beloved brother at the communion table, the institution of slavery simply cannot survive.
It subverts the system from the inside out.
Exactly.
And we can't forget the general epistles. You have a letter like James, which provides a sharp, prophetic voice, insisting that a living faith must be physically embodied.
Yes, James says, faith without works is dead. He is highly concerned with how the rich treat the poor.
It's very practical.
The general epistles provide a Catholic, meaning universal, instruction that really balances out the entire library.
You know, I always think about reading the epistles like reading someone else's mail. It's like discovering a cache of a CEO's troubleshooting memos sent out to struggling startup branches.
That's a brilliant way to look at it.
Hey, Corinth branch, stop suing each other. Hey, Galatia branch, remember the original mission statement.
Exactly.
But how did they actually experience these letters? They weren't just quietly reading them in a study, right?
Not at all. Because literacy was so low, perhaps only 10 to 15% of the population could read, these letters actually functioned as oral performances.
Performances.
Yes. An envoy sent by Paul would arrive, gather the house church, and read the letter out loud with inflection, emotion, and authority.
Wow.
They had formulaic openings designed to capture attention. The reading of the letter brought the apostolic presence right into their living room.
That is such a vivid picture, a crowded room lit by oil lamps listening to someone perform Paul's letter.
Right.
But, you know, that also leads me to a really important slightly skeptical question.
Let's hear it.
If we are dealing with ancient letters written on papyrus, sent by envoys, and then copied over and over again by hand for centuries,
Yes.
how sure are we about the texts themselves? Haven't they been playing a centuries-long game of telephone? How do we know the copy of Romans we read today is actually what Paul wrote?
That brings us to the debates over authorship and text.
Yeah, let's get into it.
It's a crucial area to explore, and the research we are analyzing gives us a very clear, objective look at the manuscript tradition and the scholarly debates. Let's start with the texts themselves. You brought up the game of telephone.
Yeah.
That is a very common analogy, but it is actually highly inaccurate for how ancient manuscripts were transmitted.
Explain that. Why isn't it like telephone?
Well, in the game of telephone, one person whispers to one person, who whispers to one person in a single linear chain, right?
Right?
And if one person messes up, the final message is permanently corrupted. But the New Testament manuscript tradition is not a single chain. It is a massive branching tree.
A branching tree, meaning...
Meaning we have thousands of handwritten Greek copies.
Oh,
Over
man.
500, 800 to be precise.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize there were that many.
And some of them are incredibly old. We have papyrus fragments like the
Yeah.
P52 fragment of the Gospel of John, which dates to roughly 120 to 130 CE.
That is mere decades after the original was written. Okay, but with 5,800 hand-copied manuscripts, there have to be mistakes. I mean, scribes get tired, eyes jump lines.
Oh, absolutely. Textual variation is a very real thing. When you have that many copies, you have scribal errors, skipped words, sometimes explanatory notes added in the margins. They get accidentally copied into the main text later.
Right, human error.
But here is the key.
Yeah.
Because we have so many copies from different geographical regions, Egypt, Syria, Rome, scholars use a science called textual criticism to compare them.
Yeah.
If a scribe in Rome makes a mistake, the copies in Egypt and Syria won't have that same mistake. So by comparing the branches of the tree, scholars can highly recover the original reading. We aren't guessing in the dark.
That makes a lot of sense. So the text itself is secure, but the authorship of the books is where things get heavily debated.
Yes.
The research outlines a major tension between traditional scholars and critical scholars. Walk us through that.
There is a clear divide here. The evangelical or traditional view retains the historical titles. They argue for direct apostolic authorship, or authorship by the immediate apostolic circle for most of the books.
So Paul wrote all 13 letters bearing his name.
Correct.
And what does critical scholarship argue?
Critical scholarship approaches it differently. They commonly treat the Gospels as formally anonymous within the text itself.
What do you mean by formally anonymous?
Well, they note that the actual text of the Gospel doesn't say, I, Matthew, am writing this. The titles, according to Matthew or according to Mark, were later church attributions attached in the 2nd century to establish apostolic authority.
Okay, I can understand that for the Gospels, but what about the letters? I need to stop you here because the notes suggest that critical scholars believe some of Paul's letters are pseudonymous.
Yes, meaning someone else wrote them using Paul's name.
Isn't that just a polite academic word for a forgery? Why would the early church ever accept a forged letter into their sacred library? That sounds crazy.
It sounds crazy to our modern sensibilities because we are obsessed with copyright and intellectual property.
Right, we want authenticity.
But in the ancient world, pseudonymity was actually a recognized literary convention, especially in Jewish and Greco-Roman philosophical schools.
Really? It wasn't seen as lying.
Not always. If you were a devoted disciple of a great teacher and a new crisis arose after that teacher's death, writing a letter addressing that crisis in the name of your teacher wasn't necessarily seen as deceptive.
It was more like an homage.
Yes, it was seen as honoring their tradition, extending their authority to a new situation.
So they weren't trying to pull a fast one. They were saying, this is what Paul would say to this situation if he were here.
That is the argument of critical scholarship, particularly regarding the pastoral epistles, which are 1 and Timothy, and Titus.
Okay, got it.
Now, traditional scholars push back hard on this. They argue that the early church actually highly valued authenticity and rejected known forgeries. They point to historical records where leaders were disciplined for writing under a false name.
So it is a fierce debate.
It is a very fierce debate, though it is interesting to note that both traditional and critical scholars universally agree on one thing.
What's that?
The book of Hebrews is entirely anonymous. Nobody knows who wrote it.
Oh, wow.
But the reason we outline these debates is because responsible inquiry requires presenting all views. Recognizing this scholarly tension doesn't destroy the text. It actually highlights how rigorously and intensely these ancient documents are studied.
And part of that rigorous study is diving into the original Greek language itself. The research highlights specific Greek words that essentially form the theological DNA of the New Testament.
Words that we think we understand today.
Right. But when you look at their original cultural context, it changes everything.
It really does. Words cannot be detached from their context.
Yeah.
Take the word agape, which we lazily translate as love.
Lazy. Why lazy?
Well, today, love is a feeling. It's romantic or affectionate, right? But agape in the New Testament represents a self-giving, sacrificial, active ethic. It is an action of the will. It's choosing the highest good for another person, regardless of how you feel about them.
So it's not a fuzzy feeling.
Not at all. Or take basileia, meaning kingdom. It doesn't mean a geographical territory with borders. It refers to the active, reigning, dynamic rule of God breaking into history.
The two words that really struck me in the research were ecclesia and euangelion. Let's start with ecclesia.
Okay.
Today, when we hear the English translation church, we immediately think of a building. We think of a brick structure with a steeple, stained glass, and pews.
That's the modern image, yeah.
But originally, it had nothing to do with religion, right?
Exactly. Ecclesia was a purely secular civic term. In a Greek city-state, the ecclesia was the gathered assembly of free citizens called out to make political decisions for the city.
So it was a political word.
Yes. When the early Christians adopted this word, they weren't saying, we are starting a new religion. They were making a profound sociological statement.
What were they saying?
They were saying, we are God's gathered assembly. We are the true citizens of a new kingdom, called out to represent his governance in the world.
And then there is euangelion, which we translate as gospel or good news.
Yes, a euangelion.
The research strongly hints that this term was incredibly politically charged. Like, if I lived in a Roman city in the 1st century and a herald rode in blowing a trumpet, shouting that he had a euangelion, what would I expect him to say?
You would expect him to announce news of imperial salvation. In the Roman world, euangelion was the exact technical propaganda term used to announce the birth of a Roman emperor, a massive military victory by Caesar, or an emperor's ascension to the throne.
Wow.
It was the good news that Rome had brought peace and salvation to the world through military conquest.
So when the Gospel of Mark opens with its very first line, the beginning of the euangelion of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, he is basically dropping a political nuke.
It is a direct, provocative, and highly dangerous political statement. Mark is co-opting imperial propaganda and applying it to a crucified Jewish rabbi.
That is so bold.
He is saying, you think Caesar is the Son of God who brings good news and peace? No. True salvation and true peace have arrived through Jesus.
That honestly gives me chills. It completely changes how you read the opening lines of these texts. They weren't just writing spiritual self-help, they were writing resistance literature.
That's a great way to phrase it, resistance literature.
So after dissecting the intense history, the letters, the Greek language, and the scholarly debates, there is one final, highly symbolic book left to unpack in this library.
The grand finale.
A book that closes out the entire grand narrative of the Bible.
The Book of Revelation. Written around 95 CE by a man named John who was exiled on the penal island of Patmos.
Which sounds like a rough place.
It was. And the book is addressed to a network of 7 churches in Asia Minor who were under immense pressure, seduction, and persecution from the Roman Empire.
The imagery in Revelation is notoriously wild. I mean, you read it and you have multi-headed beasts, dragons, bowls of wrath, scrolls with 7 seals, cosmic prostitutes. It reads like an ancient fever dream.
It does. It's intense.
The notes describe the central narrative simply. The slain lamb reigns, Babylon falls, and a new creation descends. But I have to push back here. How should modern readers actually interpret this book?
Because there's a lot of confusion out there.
Exactly. You go to any bookstore, and there are millions of dollars made selling books, claiming to decode Revelation, treating it like a crystal ball for the 21st century.
Yes. This is arguably the most misunderstood book in the entire collection. The research is very explicit here. Revelation is a prophetic apocalypse.
Apocalypse.
Yes, which is a specific ancient genre. It is emphatically not a code book for modern newspaper exegesis.
Okay.
It is not meant to be read alongside modern news headlines to predict the identity of the Antichrist or the end of the world next Tuesday.
Right.
And it is certainly not meant to be a manual for escapism, where believers just sit back and wait to be evacuated from a doomed planet.
If it's not a secret code book and it's not a timeline for the future, what is its actual function? Why use all these bizarre symbols?
Think of apocalyptic literature like modern political cartoons.
Political cartoon.
Yeah, if you see a cartoon of a donkey and an elephant fighting over a cliff, you don't literally think there are giant animals fighting in Washington.
Right.
It represents political parties. The symbols carry meaning. Revelation uses rich, incredibly dense, Old Testament symbolic imagery to pull back the curtain,
Pull back the curtain.
which is literally what the Greek word apocalypsis means,
Yeah.
an unveiling. It pulls back the curtain to show these suffering first-century Christians the true spiritual reality behind the physical world.
Ah, I see.
Rome looks invincible. Rome looks like a terrifying, unstoppable beast rising from the sea. But the true reality is that the beast is already defeated, and the throne of the universe is actually occupied by a lamb.
So its function is really to provide hope. It's saying, hang in there, things are not as they seem.
Exactly. It is prophetic encouragement for ethical perseverance under severe imperial pressure. It completes the New Testament's master redemptive historical pattern.
How does it complete it?
The narrative arc of the entire Bible moves from promise in the Old Testament to incarnation, to the cross, to resurrection, to the giving of the Spirit, to the church mission, and finally in Revelation, to the return of Christ and the new creation.
The research brings up this phrase, inaugurated eschatology. It sounds incredibly academic, but it seems to be the key to understanding how the early church viewed time.
It is. Inaugurated eschatology is the idea that the kingdom of God is already here, inaugurated in the ministry, death, and resurrection of Jesus.
So it's already started.
The decisive victory has been won. But the kingdom is not yet fully realized. Sickness, death, and evil still exist.
The already, but not yet.
Exactly. The church lives in that tension, in the overlap of the ages, suffering in the present while holding on to the absolute certainty of the final consummation.
You know, I love thinking about the narrative of Revelation like the final boss battle in a grand epic video game or an Avengers movie.
Oh, that's a fun comparison.
You spend the whole story building up to this massive cosmic clash between good and evil. But there's a massive twist. When John is weeping in chapter 5 because no one can open the scroll of history, he is told to look at the conquering lion of Judah.
Right.
He turns around expecting to see a military conqueror with a sword. Instead, he sees a slain lamb. The victory wasn't won with a sword at the end of time. It was already won by the sacrificial lamb at the cross in the middle of time.
The cross was the real battle.
Yeah. The final boss battle in Revelation is essentially just the cleanup operation.
That is a phenomenal way to frame it. The decisive victory is in the past. Revelation 21 and 22 just show us the final result. A renewed creation, a new heavens and new earth, where God's dwelling places with humanity and death, sorrow, and the curse are entirely eradicated.
Which is a beautiful image.
And notice, it's not an escape from creation. The holy city comes down to earth. It's a redemption and restoration of creation.
What a journey. From the very beginning of this deep dive, we've covered so much ground. We started in the dusty, oppressive streets and the intense honor-shame culture of the Roman Empire.
I really did.
We watched as the oral traditions, sustained by memory and community, were eventually codified into the 4 brilliant, distinct camera angles of the Gospels.
A huge transition for them.
We tracked the explosive, spirit-empowered mission of the early church in Acts, spreading from the Pool of Siloam in Jerusalem to the very heart of Rome.
The geographic spread is incredible.
And we read over the shoulders of these fragile startup house churches as they listen to Paul's troubleshooting memos, discovering that high doctrine must dictate daily ethics.
The indicatives leading to the imperatives.
Exactly. We demystified the massive manuscript tradition and the scholarly debates over authorship. And finally, we witnessed the cosmic, curtain-pulling vision of Revelation, promising that a slain lamb actually rules the universe.
It is a breathtaking literary, historical, and theological achievement. Honestly, regardless of your personal background or belief.
I agree completely.
The notes from Chris Valasis demonstrate just how historically grounded, canonically coherent, and intellectually dense this 27-book library truly is. It is not a simple fairy tale.
Yeah.
It is a complex masterpiece.
Which brings us to our final thought for you, the listener. The New Testament makes a staggering, unavoidable claim.
It really does.
It claims that Jesus of Nazareth is the interpretive center of all reality. It claims that his message wasn't just a quaint philosophy, but a historical event meant to completely reorder human status, power, and relationships.
It demands the ultimate status reversal.
Exactly. The early Christians believed this text wasn't just a source of private spiritual comfort for when you're having a bad day.
Far from it.
They believed it was the blueprint for a completely new humanity breaking into the present moment, subverting empires from the inside out. So if that normal, linear, self-centered worldview is truly broken by these texts, I want to leave you with this final provocative thought.
I love this.
How might viewing your own daily interactions, your work, your resources, your neighborhood, the way you treat people on social media, through this ancient lens of radical status reversing grace, completely change the way you live tomorrow morning?
That is a question that requires more than just listening. It demands a response.
It really does. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you've enjoyed unpacking this incredible ancient library, discovering the why and the how behind the words as much as we have. Take care, everyone.